All right, so if you've been living under a rock or at any point in the last couple hours, here's how the committee had them. We're going to do what we always do, and we're going to go through right now we don't have every single team and every single number just yet, but we're going to get there, and at some point here in the next day or so, we'll break down the top 25 in its entirety. But today is about the playoff. I'll start by saying this. The committee got it right. The committee got it right. Now, you might disagree. You might see it differently. You might feel strongly about your school and think that your school had a better argument than fill-in-the-blank university when it comes to maybe being in the college football playoff. Fair enough. But the committee, when looking at everything, got it right. Let's start by identifying one key fact as it relates to the rankings every single year. People get very hung up on the vernacular that's used as it relates to the playoff. Understandably. Why? Because the college football playoff provides us with this criteria. We want the 4 best teams. And people loosely interpret that to whatever it is they want to interpret it as. So, for instance, if your team maybe doesn't have a great resume, but they have great personnel, you're going to say, well, we're one of the 4 best. Well, if your team doesn't have great personnel, but maybe you have a great resume, you're going to say, well, we're one of the 4 best, right? It's a way to create and generate conversation. I'm sure that as they were going through the process of creating the original college football playoff, they had some type of group that made suggestions to them in an effort to create conversation, in an effort to create buzz. I'm sure some group recommended to them, hey man, I'd leave it really open-ended. Make it the 4 best and let people interpret it as they will. Well, that's exactly what we have right now. So the 4 best, well, yes, it can probably be translated and tried to understand it in several different ways. But you know what the 4 best really means? Y'all, it means the 4 most deserving. You're going to say, whoa, hang on a second. No. Yes, if you go back over the course of time, they have always taken the 4 most deserving teams. Always. The best example, if you want to go back a little bit, is probably in 2015. Now, y'all might not be able to remember this, but I remember it vividly because I remember sitting there thinking, well, if it's really about the 4 best, this team right here needs to be taken into consideration because I think right now, based on how they're playing, based on how they played in the final month of the season, based on their personnel, all those boxes that need to be checked, this team checked those boxes, and yet they were not even within striking distance of the college football playoff top 4. That team was 2015 Ohio State. Now, if you really go back and look at it, at the very worst, that 2015 Ohio State team, based on paper, on personnel, on ceiling, they were at worst the 3rd best team in America. And yet, come college football playoff selection day, they were nowhere near the top 4. Why? Because they didn't deserve to be anywhere near the top 4. It has always been about the most deserving teams. And the best way to help summarize or to help explain, hey, this team is more deserving than this team, and this more than they're deserving than this team, is win-loss record. Why? Because it's right there in front of you. It's binary. Every single game has a binary result. You either win or you lose. There's only 2 options. It's one or the other. Now, some losses are worse than others. Margins are significant. But win or lose in a binary result, it's easy to quantify when measuring teams against each other. That's why there have been examples of teams with 2 losses that have sat in front of teams with 1 loss when the final rankings are released. However, when it comes to the actual playoff itself, we have never seen a 2-loss team chosen over a 1-loss team. Thought that there might be a possibility this year. just because of how things went with Ohio State and how Alabama lost 2 close games. But ultimately, the committee said this team slipped up once, this team slipped up twice, 1 is fewer than 2, which ultimately led the committee to putting Ohio State on the 4 line. I don't have a problem with it. I think Ohio State does have flaws, but I also think Bama has flaws. I also think Tennessee has flaws. I also think that any team that lost more than once, more often than not, has flaws. People have been very hung up on, well, what would Tennessee and or Alabama, what would Vegas have them as it relates to the other 4 teams? Well, until Vegas has people on the committee, that argument to me doesn't hold water. TCU deserves it. Michigan deserves it. And of course, Georgia deserves it. Those 3 teams, no questions asked whatsoever. They're in. No debate, no denying. They deserve to be the top 3 teams in that order. Georgia 1, Michigan 2, TCU 3. People are going to say, well, TCU 3, how? How can you justify that? Well, in a weird roundabout way, you're going to think, Greg, you're crazy here. You're grasping at straws. No, I'm not. I'm just trying to see the forest through the trees. In a weird roundabout way, think about this, and you have to follow me for a second. TCU's best win got better because of their loss on Saturday afternoon. TCU's best win going into conference championship Saturday was against number 10 Kansas State. Well, they lost to Kansas State. That's ultimately, that's a ding in the armor, right? Like that is a problem, right? It's a bad thing to have a loss on your resume. But if it's your only loss, it can be forgiven, especially if you have a really good win to kind of neutralize that loss. Well, TCU's loss actually made their best win better. Wherever Kansas State ends up, that ultimately strengthens, in some ways, TCU's resume, which is exactly why TCU stayed at 3 and should stay at 3. Because TCU, even though they lost, their best win also got moved up, should cancel each other out. TCU should stay with the status quo of what we got the previous week. And then at number 4, Ohio State. I understand that they lost to Michigan. I understand that it got sideways. I understand that it was on their home field. But ultimately, I look at Ohio State, and Ohio State did beat everyone else on their schedule, with the exception of Michigan, by double digits. Now, some of those games were close. The Northwestern game was ugly. The Maryland game was ugly. There were times in which they didn't play their best football, but ultimately they won every game, with the exception of the Michigan game, by double digits. And their best win was against Penn State at their place, a team that is clearly very well respected and should be by the committee, a team that will make a trip to the Rose Bowl a few weeks from now. So Ohio State, while they have a worse loss as far as total points are concerned, and yes, it was ugly optics, I might add as well, they still have an excellent win in Penn State. Here's the problem with both Bama and Tennessee's resume when trying to acknowledge their candidacy in the playoff. Bama's best win, and this is not their fault. Bama's not in control of what teams do when they play, after they play Bama. If Texas would have gone on and won almost all of their games, maybe find their way to the Big 12 championship, they almost did, maybe win the Big 12 championship, that would have gone a long way in benefiting Alabama's resume. But ultimately, Texas went 8-4. That is Alabama's best win. Alabama's second best win was against the likes of Ole Miss. And Ole Miss played really poorly down the stretch. At the time in which Alabama beat them, it was a really good win. But then Ole Miss lost to both Arkansas and against Mississippi State, and they stumbled their way to the finish line en route to an 8-4 season. Mississippi State in the top 25, good win for Alabama, convincing win for Alabama, but still a team that's barely in the top 25. It's not Bama's fault that no one else held up their end of the bargain. But against the best teams on their schedule, a la LSU and against Tennessee, they came up just a little bit short. Now, I think the best argument to be made right now might be for Tennessee fans who finished 6th will get a trip to the Orange Bowl, and what a great destination. You get a chance to play against Clemson. I couldn't be more excited for Tennessee fans. It's a great opportunity to put a bow on what's been a phenomenal season. But if I'm Tennessee fans, I'm a little ticked off because I sit and I see the 6 next to my name. I see Bama with a 5 next to their name, and Tennessee beat Bama. So if there's a gripe in this whole conversation, it might be coming from Tennessee fans because they probably feel, and understandably so, that they should be ahead of Alabama. Ultimately, still both going to New Year's Six bowl games, still both going to great destinations, still both have a chance to finish their season on an insanely positive note, still both have a chance to play against a top 10 team in the postseason. Bama against Kansas State, obviously Tennessee against Clemson. Either way, I know we're splitting hairs, but if I were Tennessee, I'd feel a little bit upset with how things went at the very end. But ultimately, the committee got it right. And they got it right because at their core, even though the actual terminology used is 4 best teams, if we were really going to go off of the 4 best teams, what's the point in having the committee at all? Like, if we're really going to go based on personnel, why do we even play the season? Because if we're going to just go off of the 4 best teams and the teams with the most talent and with the highest ceiling, let's just take NFL GMs, put them in the committee room, and let them select the teams that are going to compete in the college football playoff. We don't want to do that, do we? Like, ultimately, you have to earn your way in. And the way you do that is by putting together a great resume. And if you put together a great resume, you deserve to be included in the college football playoff. The 4 teams that are in right now have all put together very strong resumes. They deserve to be in the college football playoff. They might not be the 4 best in your eyes, but they are undeniably the 4 most deserving. So therefore, I do think the committee got it right.